The choral notes hung suspended in the frosty December air, a harmony of voices rising toward the vaulted ceiling of the small Midwestern church. Among the singers, Pietro Rinaldi stood rigid in his borrowed suit, his tenor voice blending with the Americans surrounding him. The wooden pew beneath his fingers felt smooth and polished, so unlike the splintered benches of the prisoner camp where he had spent the last 8 months. The stained glass windows filtered the winter sunlight into kaleidoscopes of color that danced across the faces of the congregation. Faces that showed no hatred, no suspicion, just the peaceful contemplation of worship. For a moment, Pietro closed his eyes, allowing the Latin verses of Adeste Fideles to transport him across oceans and battle lines to his childhood church in Milan. How had he come to be here, singing in an American church, surrounded by the very people he had been ordered to kill just months before? What strange twist of fate had transformed him from enemy to choir member in this snowy corner of Minnesota? Pietro had entered captivity with a head full of warnings and a heart hardened by fascist propaganda. Throughout basic training in Naples, officers had painted Americans as barbaric, undisciplined mongrels, a nation of criminals without culture or respect for tradition. If captured, his commanding officer had instructed, expect the worst. These people will treat you like animals. The newsreels shown in Italian cinemas had portrayed Americans as gangsters and degenerates, their cities violent hellscapes of crime and moral decay. As his transport ship had crossed the Atlantic in the autumn of 1943, Pietro and his fellow prisoners had whispered together in the cramped holds, speculating about the horrors that awaited them: forced labor, starvation, perhaps even torture. Many had considered jumping overboard rather than face what surely lay ahead. When the ship docked at Newport News, Virginia, the prisoners shuffled up from the holds, blinking in the bright sunlight, their bodies tense with anticipation of what would come next. Instead of being beaten or paraded through jeering crowds, they were efficiently processed by military police, who spoke in calm, measured tones. No one spat at them, no one screamed for vengeance. The guards maintained a professional distance, neither cruel nor particularly kind, simply doing their jobs with minimal fuss. Most shocking of all had been the coffee, actual coffee, not the chicory substitute that had become standard in wartime Italy, served hot and strong to men who moments before had expected only brutality. "Why would they waste good coffee on us?" whispered Sergeant Mario Conti, a veteran from Sicily who had fought at El Alamein. "It must be poisoned, or a trick before they shoot us." But the coffee was neither poisoned nor a prelude to execution. It was simply coffee, the first hint that captivity in America might defy everything they had been led to believe. The train that carried them inland revealed a country untouched by bombing, its fields golden with harvests, its towns bright with electric lights that had long since been extinguished and blacked out European cities. The America outside their train windows looked nothing like the desperate, chaotic nation that Mussolini's newspapers had described. How could a country so apparently prosperous be on the verge of collapse, as they had been repeatedly told? The question lingered, unsettling in its implications. The camp itself, when they finally arrived after days of travel, resembled a simple but well-organized military base. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across former farmland, surrounded by watchtowers and fences. Yet even these structures spoke of resources that had grown scarce in Italy: unbombed lumber, fresh paint, intact glass windows. The new prisoners were issued clothing suitable for the approaching Midwestern winter: heavy wool coats, sturdy boots, thermal undergarments. For men who had shivered through North African nights in threadbare uniforms, this unexpected preparation for their comfort seemed almost suspicious in its thoroughness. That first night, lying on a real mattress beneath 2 warm blankets, Pietro had stared at the ceiling, unable to reconcile what he was experiencing with what he had been promised. The barracks were heated, the latrines were clean, the guards maintained discipline but showed no cruelty. Where was the barbarity he had been warned to expect? Where were the monsters who would surely treat Italian prisoners as something less than human? Sleep eluded him as the contradiction gnawed at his certainty. Perhaps tomorrow, he thought, the true nature of American captivity would reveal itself, a thought that would prove prophetic, though not in the way he imagined. The revelation came not through violence, but through sound. On their third morning in camp, as the prisoners assembled for roll call, music drifted from a nearby building. Not military marches or propaganda broadcasts, but the unmistakable notes of Puccini. An aria from La Bohème floated across the compound, so unexpected that several men stopped in their tracks, heads tilted as if catching the scent of home. The music came from a phonograph in the Guards' Recreation Hall, played by a young lieutenant who had studied at the Chicago Conservatory before the war. When he noticed the prisoner's reaction, he increased the volume, letting the soprano's voice soar over the barbed wire that separated them. For Pietro, who had sung in the Milan Cathedral Boys' Choir as a child, the sound cracked something open inside his chest, a feeling simultaneously painful and sweet. How could these cultureless barbarians appreciate Puccini? How could the enemy carry the beauty of Italian opera across an ocean and play it with such evident respect? Later that day, when the guards learned that several prisoners had musical training, they brought out a dusty upright piano from storage and placed it in one of the recreation halls. The invitation was tentative but clear. Music would be permitted, even encouraged, in this place of confinement. "Be careful," warned Mario Conti, watching Pietro's fingers hover over the ivory keys. "This is how they will break us, not with fists, but with kindness. Remember who you are and who they are." But when Pietro's fingers finally touched the keys, playing the opening measures of a Schubert sonata, the distinction between captive and captor blurred, if only for a moment. Several guards paused their rounds to listen, and one, a farm boy from Nebraska who had never heard classical music performed live, stood transfixed by the doorway, his rifle temporarily forgotten at his side. Music, it seemed, spoke a language that transcended the barriers of war, a realization that would only deepen in the months to come. As autumn faded into early winter, the prisoners settled into routines that further challenged their preconceptions. They worked on nearby farms, harvesting crops that would have been considered luxuries in rationed Italy: corn, wheat, apples, even beef and pork. The American Midwest produced food in quantities that seemed almost obscene compared to the scarcity they had left behind. One orchard, where Pietro was assigned to pick apples, contained more fruit than his entire neighborhood in the lawn had seen in months. The farmers, many of German or Scandinavian descent, treated the prisoners not as enemies, but as temporary laborers, offering them water and sometimes even sharing packed lunches. "My grandfather came from Dresden," one weathered farmer told Pietro in halting German, passing him a sandwich thick with ham and cheese. "War is temporary. Hunger is not. Eat." The gift was more than food. It was a gesture that defied everything Pietro had been taught to expect from Americans. The ham tasted rich and salty on his tongue, the bread soft and white, nothing like the coarse, dark loaves that had become standard in Italy. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, watching the farmer return to his tractor. Something shifted in his understanding then, a quiet recognition that perhaps the world was more complicated than the rigid divisions of ally and enemy, of right and wrong, that had been drilled into him since Mussolini's rise to power. Back at camp, other unexpected freedoms emerged. The prisoners were allowed books, music, even organized sports. A soccer field was marked out behind the mess hall, and matches between barracks became weekly events that drew crowds of guards as spectators. Religious services were not only permitted but facilitated, with Catholic priests from nearby parishes invited to celebrate Mass for the predominantly Catholic prisoners. The camp commander, Colonel James Harrington, made it clear that while security remained paramount, he considered it his duty to uphold the Geneva Convention's requirements for humane treatment, a stance that earned him both respect and confusion from his Italian charges. "In Italy, we were told, Americans have low respect for tradition or religion," remarked Corporal Enzo Ferraro, a fisherman from Naples, after attending his first Mass in the camp's makeshift chapel. "Yet here they bring us priests and Bibles. They let us pray as we always have. It's strategy, responded Mario, ever suspicious. They want to win us over, make us soft, maybe even turn us against our country. Don't be fooled by a few comforts. But comfort was not the only thing offered. Education programs were established, with English lessons available to any prisoner who wished to learn. Farm skills were taught by local agricultural experts, preparing men for work details but also providing knowledge that might be useful after the war. The camp library, though modest, contained books in multiple languages, including some Italian classics donated by university collections. For Pietro, who had left school at 16 to work in his father's tailoring shop, these opportunities for learning seemed almost more valuable than physical comforts. Most surprising of all was the mail. Unlike reports they had heard about German camps, where letters were heavily censored or simply disappeared, the American system functioned with remarkable efficiency. Once communication lines were established, Pietro received letters from his mother and sisters, their familiar handwriting a lifeline to a home that seemed increasingly distant. Though censors blacked out any military information, the personal contents remained intact. News of neighbors, family celebrations, even gentle jokes that made him laugh aloud in the quiet of his bunk. When he learned that the Red Cross packages sent from Italy actually reached the prisoners without being plundered, his understanding of American character underwent another subtle shift. Yet with each small freedom, each unexpected kindness, came an uncomfortable question. If the propaganda about American barbarism had been false, what other lies had been embedded in the ideology he had embraced? The question whispered through the barracks at night, too dangerous to voice aloud, yet impossible to silence completely. For men raised under fascism, who had been taught to see Mussolini as Italy's savior and the Americans as degenerate enemies of civilization, such doubts felt almost like betrayal. Still, the evidence of their own experience proved difficult to reconcile with what they had been told to believe. As December arrived, bringing snow that transformed the camp into a landscape of white, broken only by footpaths and fences, a new dimension of American life revealed itself. Christmas preparations began appearing throughout the compound. Not the subdued, militaristic observance they might have expected, but a genuine celebration, complete with decorations, special meals planned, and music. Colonel Harrington announced that local churches had invited groups of prisoners, under guard, to join their holiday services and choir performances, an idea that seemed both extraordinary and slightly alarming to men who had been told that Americans would treat them as dangerous enemies. "They want to put us on display," Mario warned when the invitation was translated, "like captured animals in a circus. We should refuse." But Pietro was drawn to the possibility of singing again in a proper church, of experiencing the holiday rituals that had marked every Christmas of his life before the war. When he added his name to the volunteer list, he noticed how many others did the same. Men hungry not just for a break from camp routine, but for some connection to the traditions that defined their identity beyond that of prisoner or soldier. What surprised him most was the absence of coercion. No one was forced to participate, and those who declined faced no punishment or loss of privileges. The choice itself was a kind of freedom he had almost forgotten could exist. The first rehearsal with the Methodist Church Choir in the nearby town of Sheridan revealed yet another layer of complexity. The American singers, mostly women, as many young men were away at war, welcomed the Italians with a mixture of curiosity and cautious warmth. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the choir director, spoke no Italian, but communicated through music, her hands directing tempo and volume in a language all understood. When Pietro and 3 other prisoners with choir experience began singing the Latin verses of traditional carols, her face lit with appreciation of their trained voices. "You sing like angels," she told them through an interpreter during a break, passing around a tray of homemade cookies. "War makes no sense when I hear such beauty." The comment, delivered simply as a personal observation rather than political statement, nonetheless resonated deeply with Pietro. He had joined the army because it was expected, had embraced fascist ideals because everyone around him did the same. Music had been his true passion, abandoned when war made such pursuits seem frivolous. Now, standing in this small-town American church with cookie crumbs on his fingers, he felt the artificial divisions between himself and these people dissolving note by note. Each subsequent rehearsal brought new revelations. The American choir members began bringing small gifts, hand-knitted scarves, packets of cigarettes, photographs of the town to send home to family. They shared stories of their own Italian ancestors, their desire to visit Venice or Rome someday, their appreciation for Italian culture. For men who had been taught that Americans were cultureless barbarians, these conversations were as disorienting as they were enlightening. How could their enemies hold such genuine admiration for Italian achievements? How could people they had been ordered to hate show such humanity? "They're softening us up," Mario insisted when Pietro described the rehearsals, "making us forget why we're here. Remember, these same friendly people are killing our brothers in Sicily right now." The reminder was sobering, yet it could not fully erase what Pietro had experienced. The contradiction remained. These Americans, supposedly his sworn enemies, treated him more humanely than he had sometimes been treated by his own officers. They valued his voice, respected his faith, preserved his dignity, even in captivity. The cognitive dissonance created a fracture in his worldview that widened with each passing day. As Christmas approached, the temperature dropped to levels few Italians had ever experienced. The Midwestern winter revealed itself in bitter winds and snowdrifts that transformed the landscape into something alien and beautiful. Inside the heated barracks, the prisoners gathered around radios, another unexpected privilege, listening to news of the war's progress, news that increasingly suggested Italy's cause was lost. When word came that Italian forces in North Africa had surrendered and Mussolini had been deposed, the camp fell into a strange silence, men processing what this meant for their status and their future. Colonel Harrington addressed them directly, speaking through interpreters to ensure everyone understood. Their treatment would not change based on Italy's political situation. They would continue to receive the same food, shelter, and privileges as before. The choir program and church visits would proceed as planned. This reassurance, delivered matter-of-factly rather than as propaganda, carried a dignity that many found surprisingly comforting amid the uncertainty. The Christmas Eve service itself became the culmination of everything Pietro had experienced in captivity. Dressed in borrowed suits and ties, 20 Italian prisoners were transported under light guard to 3 different churches in Sheridan, where they joined local choirs in celebrating midnight mass and holiday services. At the Methodist church where Pietro had been rehearsing, the sanctuary was filled with evergreen bows, red ribbons, and candlelight that softened the features of everyone present. The prisoners entered not as a shameful parade of enemies, but as welcomed guests, guided to places among the regular choir members. When the music began, something extraordinary happened. Pietro's voice, joining with American voices in Silent Night and O Holy Night, created a harmony that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. The congregation, which included families of men fighting overseas, perhaps even fighting Italians, watched without hostility, some with tears in their eyes at the beauty of the music. For 2 hours, in that candle-lit space, the divisions of war seemed to dissolve into something older and more fundamental, a shared humanity expressed through faith and song. Afterward, the church ladies had prepared a reception with coffee, cider, and Christmas cookies. Pietro found himself surrounded by Americans eager to speak with him, to hear about his family in Milan, to share their own holiday traditions. A woman whose son was serving in the Navy pressed a small package into his hand, a handmade scarf and a pocket New Testament in Italian. "Merry Christmas," she said simply, her eyes meeting his directly. "God doesn't see uniforms." The ride back to camp was silent, each man absorbed in his own thoughts. The guard escorting them, a young corporal from Kentucky, hummed Christmas carols softly as the truck navigated snowy roads. Pietro fingered the gift in his pocket, trying to reconcile what he had just experienced with everything he had been taught about America and its people. How could a nation supposedly composed of uncultured barbarians show such appreciation for music, such respect for religious traditions not even their own? How could a people described as selfish individualists demonstrate such community spirit and generosity? Christmas Day in camp brought further surprises. The mess hall served a special meal that included turkey, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, and pumpkin pie. American traditions unfamiliar to the Italians, but appreciated nonetheless. The guards, many missing their own family celebrations, seemed determined to create some sense of holiday spirit even within the confines of captivity. Colonel Harrington visited each barracks personally, offering season's greetings and small packages of cigarettes and candies, his gesture neither condescending nor propagandistic, but simply human. In the evening, a group of local musicians arrived to perform a small concert, including several Italian arias in tribute to their audience. The camp's recreation hall, decorated with paper chains and a small Christmas tree, became a temporary oasis of normality in the strange circumstance of wartime imprisonment. Pietro, watching his fellow prisoners laugh and applaud the performances, realized how dramatically their expectations had been upended. They had come prepared for cruelty and found kindness, anticipated hatred and discovered respect, expected barbarism and encountered civilization. For some, like Mario, this contradiction remained deeply unsettling, a challenge to beliefs too fundamental to abandon easily. "Don't forget," he would mutter during such moments of apparent harmony, "they're still our enemies. This changes nothing." But his words carried less conviction than before, undercut by the evidence all around them. Others embraced the revelation more openly, beginning to question the propaganda that had shaped their understanding of the world and their place in it. Pietro found himself somewhere in between, unable to fully abandon his Italian identity and loyalty, yet increasingly uncertain about the enemy he had been taught to hate. The Christmas choir experience had cracked something open inside him, allowing questions that would have been unthinkable months before. If Americans valued Italian culture, respected Catholic traditions, and treated prisoners with humanity, what did that say about the ideology that had declared them subhuman enemies? If captivity in America meant better food, medical care, and living conditions than many Italians experienced at home, what did that suggest about the relative strengths of their nations? These questions followed him into the new year, as winter settled fully over the camp and news from Europe brought increasingly dire reports of Italy's situation. Letters from home described shortages, bombings, and uncertainty as the country split between those loyal to the fascist regime and those supporting the Allied forces. The comparative peace and plenty of the American Midwest began to seem not just surprising, but almost miraculous, a strange twist of fate that had removed these prisoners from the worst suffering of their countrymen. By spring, when the snow finally melted and the Minnesota landscape erupted in unexpected green, many of the Italian prisoners had undergone a transformation as profound as the changing season. The church choir program had expanded, with regular visits now permitted to multiple congregations. Baseball replaced soccer as the camp's primary sport, with prisoners forming teams and competing against each other with borrowed equipment. English classes grew so popular that additional teachers were recruited from nearby towns. For Pietro, whose beautiful tenor voice had made him something of a local celebrity during choir performances, America had ceased to be an abstraction, the faceless enemy of propaganda posters, and had become instead a complex reality of individual people with their own strengths and flaws. The Methodist choir director, Mrs. Paterson, had taken a special interest in his musical talent, bringing him classical recordings and sheet music, encouraging him to consider studying voice professionally after the war. These small kindnesses, offered without political agenda, did more to reshape his worldview than any propaganda campaign could have achieved. When Italy officially surrendered to Allied forces in September 1943, the status of Italian prisoners in America underwent another shift. Many were reclassified as Italian service units, given increased freedom and responsibilities, allowed to work without guards on farms and in factories experiencing labor shortages. The barbed wire remained, but its meaning had changed. Less a barrier keeping dangerous enemies contained than a formality maintaining the technical requirements of international law. On Christmas Eve of 1944, Pietro once again sang in the Methodist Church in Sheridan, Minnesota. This time, he stood not as a foreign curiosity, but as a recognized member of the choir. His voice blending with those who had once been strangers, but now greeted him by name. His English, while still heavily accented, had progressed enough to allow real conversations, real connections with the community that had welcomed him so unexpectedly. As the congregation joined in singing Silent Night, Pietro thought of his family in Milan, of the Christmas they might be experiencing amid the ongoing chaos of war. He thought of the journey that had brought him here, of the propaganda and hatred he had left behind, and of the unexpected kinship he had found among people he had been taught to despise. The paradox of finding humanity in captivity, of discovering freedom within confinement, seemed both miraculous and somehow inevitable, as if the artificial divisions of war could never fully overcome the deeper connections of shared culture, faith, and music. Later, when asked about his experiences as a prisoner in America, Pietro would often return to that moment, standing in the choir loft on Christmas Eve, surrounded by voices lifted in harmony, the candlelight reflecting off faces that no longer seemed foreign or threatening, but simply human. "They let us sing," he would say, as if those three words contained all the contradiction and revelation of his captivity. In the midst of war, they let us join our voices with theirs. And in that moment, I understood something about America that no propaganda could ever have taught me. What Pietro and thousands of other Italian prisoners discovered in American camps was not just a nation different from what they had been led to expect, but a reflection of possibilities they had forgotten could exist, of connections that transcended political boundaries, of humanity that survived even the divisions of war. In church choirs and camp kitchens, on baseball fields and farm details, these men glimpsed an alternative to the rigid ideologies that had set them against each other, finding instead the shared traditions and values that united them across battle lines. Perhaps in these quiet moments of connection, a Christmas carol sung together, a meal shared across cultural divides, lay the true antidote to the hatred and fear that fuel conflicts. What might our world look like if we could see beyond the uniforms and flags to the common humanity beneath, as those American congregations did when they welcomed enemy prisoners into their choirs on that distant wartime Christmas?